it may seem like quite a deviation from your previous movies, this one, for many reasons, no? How did you get into the project? How did you get into the adaptation of this book by Brian Selznick, no?
Yeah. Um, the project actually came to me through Sandy Powell, who is the costume designer on Wonderstruck, and she did my film Velvet Goldmine, and she did Carol, and Sandy got to know Brian working on Hugo, which was Scorsese's adaptation of one of Brian, first adaptation of a Brian Selznick novel, and this is the first time Brian had adapted one of his own books, and Sandy, I think, read the script and thought it was something that reminded her of me. And at first, Brian Selznick was like, "You're crazy. He would never want to do something like this." And but when I read it, I found that well, there were just many things about it that attracted me. Clearly, what attracted me from the outset was the formal dual styles of two time periods and the sort of dialogue that goes on between these two moments, using New York City as the continuum with a 50-year gap between the two. The theme of deafness was incredibly compelling. But really the reason that I felt this would be a challenge to me, something I had never done before, is that it was a film that was, you know, about the imagination of young people, the stories of young people, and a film that I think young people would have access to, which is something I've never really approached. And, you know, movies meant a tremendous amount to me when I was young. And they started to change the way I saw the world, and they made me want to make movies from a very young age when I first was stricken by cinema. And so I thought a lot about my own relationship to films as a young person, and felt like, you know, there were certain films that blew my mind when I was a kid. And they weren't necessarily films made for young audiences. Some were, and some weren't. And I just felt like, wow, I wanted to maybe give something or have something made that was very, very special, very cinematic, that really asked all the elements of the cinematic language to step forward and tell the story, because it doesn't rely on dialogue. And have that be something that kids could have access to.
As you said, this absence of dialogues force you to have the image as the main tool, the pure image and the narration. I'm sure it was really a challenge, no, to create this richness of sensorial elements, tell visually the deafness, I don't know, also musically, by the way. We will talk about it later if you want.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it definitely starts with the image. It always really starts with the image for me. But in this case, because they were deaf, because dialogue wasn't the carrier of information for so much of the film, it called upon the visual language to really step forward. But that is also true for the editorial language of the film, because it's also about the contrast between the two periods, and that the mystery, and it was another genre I hadn't really explored in other films of mine, the mystery genre is, you know, contained in the very the cuts from black and white to color. The mystery keeps getting reinstated, the question, why are these two stories being told? What's the origin? What's the source? Why are these two kids both, how do they end up both being deaf? There's a sort of sense of fatedness about the narrative that drives it. But so it's editorial, it's visual, and then it's sonic. It's very much about the sound design, and both how music plays, but also sound design itself, to really try to put you into the experience of both of these kids' experiences, but also the cinematic languages that are associated with silent cinema, 1927, and then 1977.
Outstanding work by Carter Barwell, by the way. Not your first collaboration with him. Music has been very important in your films, both, let's say, pop music, rock music, but also incidental music scores. No? Would you like to talk a little bit about how you work with Mr. Barwell, and also how important the music is for your films?
Yeah, this film was a remarkable situation in that we knew music, we knew sound, we knew the experience of the musical and sonic experience of the movie were primary. And so we started to talk about music earlier than I usually do, particularly when it's score. And we're not talking about pop music relevant to the theme of a glam rock movie or a Bob Dylan movie. This is the only time I think that the score and the discussion about the score and what that language would be like and how it would reflect and bring out components of the two stories. Because it's as much a part and it's as important to the color passages of the film as it is to the black and white, where it's really played up front. But just in cutting Wonderstruck, you know, my editor Fonzo and I couldn't even put two of the shots in the black and white story together without having music as an example. Even just it was always temp track at the beginning of the process. And I've never, you know, you just couldn't tell how it was going to work, how the very, you know, silent component of the film would hold together and draw your attention and keep you engaged without having music from the very beginning. So music in the editing, which actually preceded Carter's re-entry into the process, was the glue. It was the sort of firmament that carried the narrative and carried the two narratives and let them speak to each other. And that's always a difficult transition for a composer, because many directors fall in love with their temp music, and you often rely on it to a remarkable degree, rhythmically, tonally, evocatively, emotionally, to structure your scenes. It becomes a template that you then have to remove and have a composer come in and replace. Obviously, the integrity of a comprehensive score that's being composed for the film brings a whole other level of, thematic unity to the film. But it was a really challenging process. It was like over 80 minutes of score, which is it's a lot for any film, even for a film that has to do with kids or kids' films. But and we were even while we were recording the score in London, we were making changes, and Carter was rewriting cues all night long, orchestrating them as the dawn would crack, rushing to the studio, handing the new pages to the musicians. It was we sort of didn't leave enough time for how big the music really was.
Christine, looking back to your, I think, 26 years of collaboration together, if I counted right, pretty much, and a lot of film. Yeah, exactly. It's a question for both of you, actually. How do you see your collaboration over the years? Has it changed? Has it evolved in any way? Or it's basically the main characteristic is a continuity in your collaboration?
You know, I mean, it's a great privilege to be able to, especially you guys are all so young, but to be able to sit here and say that, you can work with somebody for 26 years or however long it is, and of course things change, but I think that really what happens is a kind of shorthand evolves, an ability to oftentimes, Todd will say, "Did you?" And I will be like, "Yes." because I already know what he's going. I already know what he's going to ask, and then but same thing, I'll be like, oh, the one thing we have to. He's like, we have. So that that is that's great, but really the extraordinary thing is to to be able to work with somebody that you have that kind of connection with creatively and empathy for in terms of the creative process. Because I think, I'm not an artist, I would imagine, and this is something Todd would have to speak to, but I would imagine as an artist, as a filmmaker, finding somebody who actually has empathy for the process in a way that is very encompassing and comfortable is probably a big part of one's ability to do it. Because I feel like from where I sit, I know how hard it is what Todd does. I know that his construction of every single piece of that frame, I know what goes into it. I really do. And I feel that my empathy and understanding of how much you have to do to make that happen helps you make it happen.
Absolutely. And the other amazing thing, this is the crazy extra part of it all, is that, I mean, we began as peers in college. We kind of, we've been through the changes, the cultural and social changes that have formed us as individuals, as as people with specific outlooks on the world, a political and social consciousness, a kind of reason why art and film matter and had a kind of necessity to be engaged, but we've remained, this is rare, I think, for people who work as closely and for as many years as we have, we remain really close friends, like really, really dear, reliable, solid friends. And that, given how crazy it is to make movies, the risks that you take, the vulnerabilities that you confront, the changing industry, the different modes of production, the struggle to get financing, and also that most of these films that we made together have been experiments and have not really followed, neither sort of the prescription of the time necessarily, or even the prescription of things that I have done before. Right. Like the whole new queer cinema frame that was first put on my work in the early days was immediately something that was challenged by the second feature I made, which was Safe, which to me is still a queer film. It just doesn't have queer subjects in it. It makes you think more about what makes queerness a point of view, a way of looking at or critiquing culture, rather than something that's just about content and just about affirmative content. So I feel like we've also ridden a rocky and risky path together. But there's no way, I mean, Safe is a great example. I would have given up. You were the one who kept, it took us years to get the financing for Safe, and if we were trying to make Safe today, we would never get the financing for Safe.
We'd make it as like we'd somehow, I remember we kept being told, pitch it as a horror film. And Todd, which it kind of was, but it also wasn't really in the DNA of how you really saw it.
Right.
So that was, I feel that almost every movie you've made has been like a little ahead of its time. So we've had, the films never die, which is amazing, or I should say, they keep finding new life. Right. And my 18-year-old daughter, one of her friends, started telling me about this great movie, Velvet Goldmine, and I was like, guess what? But movies that can be rediscovered that way, right. I think that's just, what more do you want?
I know, completely. Yeah, and you don't really set out. You don't necessarily set out for that to be the case. How could you?
You can't.
You just follow some instinct, but I have the fortification and the determination and the confidence of Christine, you know, that completely structures, and it's the foundation upon which these projects are allowed to come to life.
Some people may think that now it's more difficult than ever to try to make art house independent. I mean, independent in spirit more than anything else. Movies. Is that true, or just the difficulties have changed, but they've always been difficulties? What's your point of view about it?
I mean, it is like that French proverb, the more it changes, the more it stays the same. And there are disruptors like Amazon and Netflix that have different economic models and are saying, you know, yes, we want to make these kinds of films by these kind of filmmakers, and our economic model is not just tied to who goes to the theater or who downloads it on, you know, on iTunes. It's tied to bringing people to different platforms for different things. You know, obviously Amazon's about bringing you to a platform to buy other things. So those disruptors, I think, in a crazy way, have been really good in terms of bringing more resources to content creation. All of that said, you know, I feel like 20 years ago, we were also in, you know, a little crisis of how do we get these movies made? How do we get them seen? And it's like, you know, it's threading a very delicate needle. But somehow it keeps happening. And Todd and I were talking earlier about, film prints, about the fact that he's having a retrospective in Vienna, and they want to show everything that he's done on film, and he's shot everything on film. So we're scrambling a little bit to deal with the fact that more and more venues, contrary to what you'd think, want these original film prints, which is, you know, an interesting kind of pendulum swing.
Is that happening in Europe? It's starting to happen increasingly in cities in the United States, definitely in New York, but certain models of theaters like the Metrograph, which has only been open for a couple of years now, whose mandate was just to show films on print, films on film, and show prints and track them down. And it has been incredibly successful, and a huge devoted audience of a lot of young people, which is the best thing when you go to film screenings and you see young people seeing, you know, diverse and interesting programming, and then when that starts to be replicated in other smaller cities that don't necessarily have the same homogeneity of New York City, heterogeneity of New York City, it's great. It's great to see that. So it feels like it's sort of the Alamo is a model that came out of Texas, but it's spreading around the country with new theaters. Portland, Oregon, where I live, has theaters that are really doing extremely well with showing films on prints, and that becomes an advertising point, you know. So, but we have to sort of keep that counter sort of energy moving in that direction to make that still a value, and that it means something, and that going to the theater means something, and that sharing a movie with a group in the dark on a big screen still has a cultural value.
Let's open the round for questions in the audience. If we see anything here. We don't really see well the hands, but yeah. You.
Hello, good afternoon, and it's really great to have this opportunity to have you here. For all movie lovers, I think we all are. You have spoken about some technical stuff, music and all things, but I actually have not seen the movie today. I have my ticket for tomorrow, but I think I've seen all your previous movies and enjoyed it very much. And I noticed that Julianne Moore is here. She has been in at least Away from Her, another one. And in the previous one, you had great actresses, especially Kate Blanchett, fascinating women. Could you speak us about the importance of actresses especially, or actors in general in your movies?
Yeah, Julianne plays almost a triple role in Wonderstruck, which was a great delight to have her play this part, and something she'd never done before, a non-speaking characters in all three cases. But I've been extremely lucky. And there was a time at the beginning of our career where it wasn't an automatic concept that actors of name would be drawn to independent film. Really, you almost have to go back to like Drugstore Cowboy, Matt Dillon and Gus Van Sant's film, where it was like novel to see a name actor, making a film and starring in a film by an independent filmmaker who had a very unique and special point of view, and putting that actor in unknown territory and often challenging roles and challenging circumstances. That became something that was both, of course, beneficial to the director, who would get their film made by the virtue of having a name actor, and financiers could feel more secure in investing in it and thinking that it would have a theatrical outcome. But it would be really, really meaningful and artistically gratifying to the actor, who would start to feel limited in their roles that they would be getting from studio films. And now that's an old model that's sort of already maybe had 3 or 4 changes and variations and over the years. But I was lucky enough to also, both have some name actors come to my films, but also sort of begin my career with people like Julianne Moore, who was also still sort of finding her footing as an actor. And she had done a Robert Altman film, Shortcuts, right when we were casting Safe.
Soap operas. That was her.
And soap operas.
Right.
Exactly, and won awards for playing good and evil twins, right, on General Hospital. But she was, I think it was because she had just done the Robert Altman film that there was some bankability, that people felt secure with us casting a slightly more named star in the film than we were considering otherwise. But really, it was just this unbelievable person, this incredible actor and brilliant artist, and her ability to interpret this character that I'd written on the page. It was almost an unplayable, vacant, absent central subject in a story, and make it viable, make it real, bring a sense of authentic life to it, while still completely and totally respecting the conceptual framework of what we were trying to do, like understanding it as an actor in a way that only a great actor can, that becomes a partnership and a fulfillment of your own ambitions as a director. So that relationship has sort of been one that we've continued to grow. I mean, she's done many, many different kinds of movies and done Hollywood films and continued to do great work in independent film. But, I've always loved certain genres of film that feature female subjects. And so I've gone back to these kinds of melodramas or domestic stories where women are more upfront and center in the story, and where certain kinds of social constraints are built into those genres that I feel speak more to the kind of constraints we all feel and we all experience in life. They're not escapist stories. They're stories that reflect the limits of our lives and the hard choices that we often have to make around love and family and very basic questions and issues. And I'm certainly not the first director who's found interest in these kinds of compressed and claustrophobic narratives about domestic life. But I definitely have been able to bring amazing artists into the process with me.
More questions over there? Okay, let's go. Okay.
Vale, yo te quería preguntar sobre cómo has jugado en esta película con los materiales, porque he visto la escena final en la que has jugado con las figuras y con todo. ¿Cómo es esa experiencia?
He's asking about how you work with, in the last part of the movie, the maquettes and the little toys and the materials. How do you work with that that section of the movie?
Well, the miniatures in Wonderstruck, I made a film early in my career that kind of was really the film that brought initial attention to me as a young director of film, called Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story. It was about the pop singer Karen Carpenter, who was known in the early 1970s, but who suffered from anorexia nervosa and died in 1983. From conditions associated with that illness, and it brought new attention to that struggle and that whole issue when she did pass away. And I told that story with Barbie dolls, and they were treated very much like puppets. It wasn't stop frame animation. We manipulated the dolls with little sticks and little pulleys off camera. And that was an attempt to sort of apply the whole questions about the female body, the cultural sort of pressures laid on women and their self-regard, and how these kinds of dolls and these kinds of, traditions of childhood play often contribute to these issues and these pressures. And the amazing thing about the movie, and it was our goal in making it, was that you stop thinking that they're dolls as you watch it. And at first you think it's kind of humorous or ironic. And it's very much like the music of the Carpenters, which feels superficial and manipulative. And then you find yourself weeping by the same token. So it played this interesting game of sort of emotional manipulation, while keeping you very aware of how that manipulation is being played out. And in many ways, the final section in Wonderstruck was a return to that language. In the case of Wonderstruck, it made sense to us all in the film because it was using the diorama, like in the Natural History Museum, and the miniatures that little Rose begins making as a child, and then ends up finding a career making when she's hired later, as we learn, to make the scale model of the panorama in New York City. That these were the terms, these was the language that was already being explored in the movie, and that meant something very specifically to each child in the story. And so we thought, okay, let's make these memories that Ben is hearing from Rose a kind of depiction through the language of the diorama. So there were all these sort of heightened moments, static moments of the puppets in privileged little, tableaus of their story, where we would just add a little bit of movement here or there to kind of accent it. But it was mostly about that whole idea of the way we understand time and history by putting them in a box and regarding them through a frame. It's very much what both of these kids were drawn to as characters.
Hi. I want to be a filmmaker one day up here. Hey.
Oh, hey.
Hi. And I know my way is going to be hard because I'm a woman, and I know it's going to be even harder because I want to make LGBT films. I not centered in the LGBT part of the characters, but I want to make movies that are wherever or happen wherever, and I want my characters to be LGBT. And I wanted to ask, how hard was it to be able to make Carol? How hard was it to put it through the industry and I don't know, and take it to the cinemas? How hard was it? I want to be prepared to the future.
I think, Carol was a film that we knew in order for it to get the financing that it required in terms of the vision and the scale and the scope, we would have to have actors of the level of Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara. Todd alluded to this a little bit before, how casting, at least in the States, does dictate to a certain degree the scope and the scale of the kind of story that you're able to tell. So I can talk about this for a very long time, and I do often, about, and I won't, don't worry, but about how your budget and your subject matter and your star and your filmmaker in our particular scenario, where we have no film subsidies. I believe you guys do, but we don't. So we have to figure out a very complicated formula of the way those things work together. So with Carol, we had a filmmaker who, Todd had already a international reputation, and his films had already demonstrated that they could win awards and get that kind of critical acclaim. With the actresses, Cate Blanchett and Rooney, that brought it to the level that we needed, that helped us find the audience, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, answering your question specifically about, how do you make films right now with LGBT characters, and how do you find that audience, and through finding that audience, find the memes to make those films? That is, that's a big question that kind of varies from culture to culture, and almost platform to platform. I mean, in some ways, at least in the US, I feel like those characters are more alive on the small screen than they are on the big screen, where those stories really, you can delve into their stories more, and those platforms, whether it's actual television or streaming platforms like Amazon and Netflix, are willing to put a lot of muscle behind those kinds of characters.
I mean, in some venues, one almost asks, how do you make a film without LGBT characters? Right. Because it really does have a currency and a cultural meaning and viability today that it might not have had in the past, but even in saying that, I feel like it's not a complete picture. That in many ways, when the new queer cinema was upon us and was named New Queer Cinema in 1991, and it was very much the product, the result of the AIDS epidemic, and then sort of new era of filmmakers responding to that socio-political, cultural crisis, health crisis, out of a necessity to respond and say something about it. And all of a sudden, but what it really was, in maybe the most cynical way, was identifying a market, was identifying the fact that there was a market. People would go see these movies. There was an audience for these kinds of movies and these themes. In a funny way, the art house market has always been a gay audience, an audience that has understood alternative stories. And even if it's sometimes in the guise of a Tennessee Williams play, where homosexuality is the sort of subtext bristling beneath the surface. And that would be played out in A-list Hollywood productions, Tennessee Williams plays. But there was always, I mean, I grew up in this, late 60s and 70s, going to art house cinemas in Los Angeles, and it was a queer audience. It really was. And a lot of the movies that gained certain kinds of following and a certain force in the art house were gay-themed films. And so I think it's a lot about not just gay subjects, but subjects about minorities in general, and different kinds of experiences and relations to power and dominant culture that have always been a kind of lifeblood of movies. Movies have always been about sort of the forbidden, whether they're Hollywood films or independent films. And I think that's, to not see that longer history is also, kind of a narrower vision, that we get a little centric about our current moment. And we forget that there's a complicated and interesting past that produced it.
Hi, I think you make a very sensitive, delicate, beautiful film, so thank you for that. This was great too. I find that your narratives, they do have a dramatic arc, but not a typical Hollywood dramatic arc. It's not one straight narrative line building up towards a climax with then a cathartic moment and some sort of epilogue. Is that conscious? Do you care to elaborate?
It's, I guess I think of them so much in isolation, like that each film is sort of its own beast, its own child or offspring that demands a specific kind of attention. And I have tried, although there's certainly through lines in my films and thematic interests that have recurred. I've tried to kind of take on different genres or different kinds of movies time and again. Carol was a film that returned to gay, lesbian themes, but it was also the first time I ever really did a love story. And it really made me want to think about what the love story genre has always done and the different sort of interesting ways that it works in other movies. Yes, it is, but Far From Heaven, the love story is so entangled with other kinds of social constraints. In a funny way, the women are absolutely confident about their love in Carol. And in fact, once they realize they're being hunted and challenged by the outside, it makes them only more convicted about their love for each other. I mean, Carol ultimately makes a very hard decision, but we all know that the love itself is the strongest component of that story, and it's somehow gonna win out in the end, and it does. But yeah, I think yeah, each film sort of has taken on. And it's funny because I sort of, as Christine was saying, when we have screenings of my films, I always see little different audiences that attach themselves to specific films. There's a following for Velvet Goldmine of people who really dig that movie that's very, very different from people who like Far From Heaven, different from the Dylan fans for I'm Not There, different from the lesbian culture that's really embraced Carol. And that's cool. So I feel like they've sort of attached themselves to different components of audiences as audiences find them.
Sí, ¿aquí? Ahí. Vale. Hola, me gustaría saber si parte de la idea de la película ha surgido de la canción de Space Oddity de David Bowie.
I understood David Bowie and Pellicula.
Part of the idea of the movie comes out from the song.
This one.
Yeah.
I'll let you answer that. The song is actually in the novel of Brian Selznick's and in his script adaptation. So Space Oddity was always present in the concept of the film. I think the whole metaphor of stars and space and how that first is a connotation of the constellations and literally the solar system for Ben becomes a very different meaning of the world of stars for Rose. So it's almost a little, metonymic link between the two stories, but with a twist on that term, on that phrase. But I also think he just felt tremendous affection, as we all do, as I do as well, for that song and for that artist. Almost to the degree where I was considering making Wonderstruck, and we were beginning to have conversations about it when David Bowie died. And I almost thought, oh no, is it going to be too hard to use Space Oddity in this film with it being sort of played, among many other Bowie songs so much? Was it going to lose its, kind of uniqueness to this moment in this narrative and this particular 70s story? But I think we needed to go through that process as a society that was moved and changed by David Bowie. And And hopefully we will never stop being moved and changed by David Bowie, regardless of what song you're referring to.
Sadly, we have to leave it here. We ran out of time. It's always a pleasure to be with you. When you came, both of you as president of the jury, we were there. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. We could be here for hours, but you have your schedule solo to continue. Thank you so much for coming, and very good luck with the Velvet Underground documentary that you are working on.
Thank you.